Hello and welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Webinar Series and Podcast. I'm Stacy Roman and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Izabella Tabarovsky, a Senior Advisor at the Kennan Institute of the Wilson Center and Research Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy, ISGAP, and author, join us to discuss the sinister legacy of Soviet anti-Israel propaganda. Ms. Tabarovsky will speak for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Ms. Izabella Tabarovsky.
Thank you very much, Stacy. It's wonderful to be here at the Middle East Forum. So I want to start by showing you two slides. So Stacy, could I ask you please to show the first slide? So this first slide comes from the French edition of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It was published in the 1920s. I'm sure that most of the audience here knows what the Protocols of the Elders of Zion are, but I'll just say very briefly that it is one of the most influential books of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. This is important because anti-Semitism is not just prejudice like any other prejudice. It is fundamentally a conspiracy theory. This is important, and as we continue, you will see what I mean. So the Protocols of the Elders of Zion has been one of the most influential books in this regard in propagating anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. So on this picture, you see a spider presented as a Jew, or a Jew as a spider. How do we know that it's a Jew? Because of the exaggerated Jewish features, and actually, we know it from the words, which says danger or peril, Jewish peril. This Jew has a Bolshevik cap on his head, and this tells you about the flexibility of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, which morphs from, it kind of adapts to the current enemy. So at the time, in the 1920s, the Jew represented Bolshevism, and Bolshevism was viewed as a Jewish kind of system and movement, and that's why you have this representation. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion had a major influence on Hitler and the Nazis in general, so much so that one scholar referred to the book as a warrant for genocide. The Bolsheviks outlawed this kind of anti-Semitic propaganda. The Soviet Union for many decades presented itself as standing at the forefront of the fight against anti-Semitism. And now I want to ask Stacy to show us the second slide. Okay, so on this slide, we see a photograph, an image that was made in 1971 at the May Day parade in Moscow. Today is May Day, so it's actually really appropriate for us to be looking at this slide. So what do you see here? You see once again a Jew represented as a spider and vice versa. How do we know that it's a Jew? Because of the crooked nose and because of the Star of David on his cap. So the question arises, why is it? How is it? And by the way, once again, we have a Jew represented as a subhuman and super powerful, right? So the question arises, why is it that in the Soviet Union in 1971, we are seeing an anti-Semitic picture that essentially reproduces the cover of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? This makes zero sense, right? May Day parade, internationalist holiday. Why are we seeing this representation? And on a float that's surrounded by children of all places. So for those of you who read Russian, you probably already understand why. And the answer is in the slogan, which says, Zionism is a weapon of imperialism. So this is really significant, right? So the Soviet Union is trying to tell us that this image now is not about Jews, it's about Zionists. And of course, we don't have time today to discuss how much more powerful images are over words. But here, it's actually a really excellent illustration, because if, for example, you don't speak Russian or French, these two images will essentially look the same to you. They are about Jewish or Zionist power, but the image is the same in essence. So I'm a scholar of Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda. And one of the most striking aspects of contemporary anti-Zionist discourse here in America is the extent to which it reproduces the tropes, the motifs, and the conspiracist explanatory logic of Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda. Specifically, the Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda campaigns of 1967 to 1989. I emphasize this because we're not talking about Stalin. We're talking about, this is long past Stalin. This is essentially coming to the last 20 years of the Cold War. What were the tropes of this propaganda? Zionism is racism, Zionism is fascist, Israel is a settler colonial state, Israel is a tool of imperialism, Zionists are Nazis, Israel is an apartheid state, Zionists collaborated with the Nazis during World War II, Israel is a tool of American foreign policy, the Zionist lobby controls American politicians, Zionist money controls American media and politics, Zionists invoke anti-Semitism to silence criticism of Israel. If you follow this issue closely today, if you follow this discourse closely, all of this will sound familiar to you. And all of this was created and propagated by the USSR over 50 years ago. The USSR created these ideas, these slogans, to meet its own domestic and foreign policy objectives, including its foreign policy objectives in the Middle East. 1967 is the turning point here. That's when Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda goes global. That year, of course, Israel won in the Six-Day War over the Arab armies, which were generously supplied and trained by the Soviet Union. And the Israeli victory, which came completely unexpected to the USSR, just like to everybody else, created an internal shock in Moscow. So they had to develop a new approach to fighting what they now viewed some kind of a powerful enemy that fought against their interests globally. So they're falling on familiar conspiracy tropes. So for 20 years, Soviet propaganda pushes these ideas out to the global left and the developing world as it attempts to build allies. They use their massive media apparatus, international media apparatus. They work through diplomatic channels. They use their Academy of Sciences to legitimize the propaganda. They work directly with left-wing press and left-wing parties, which the Soviet Union financed or at a minimum subsidized generously. It is impossible to understand contemporary left-wing discourse without Zionism and about Zionism and Israel without looking at Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda. And one of the issues that this historical context helps us understand about the current moment is the problem of anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism, which is one of the crucial aspects of contemporary left-wing discourse. We often hear that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not the same. And in principle, they don't have to be, but in practice, most of the time, they are. They're the same in the most critical way possible. Both lead to anti-Semitic outcomes for Jews. And there is a reason for that. Both rely on the tropes and ideas that come from Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda, which itself relied on the tropes and ideas of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory as laid out in the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, to be sure, Soviet propaganda talked about Zionists, not Jews, but it is in part because they couldn't do it any other way. They couldn't openly recreate far-right racist anti-Semitic tropes because the USSR positioned itself as a left-wing, anti-racist, internationalist superpower and the leader of the progressive forces of the world. So what they did was essentially to reframe the protocols as a Marxist-Leninist critique. Where the protocols talked about international Jewry, which sought to gain control of the world, Soviet propaganda talked about international Zionism that sought to do the same. Where the protocols talk about Jews controlling the media and politicians, Soviet propaganda talked about Zionists doing the same. And as we saw in the two cartoons that I showed you, the substitution of Zionist for Jew didn't actually change the fundamental message and the underlying mechanism, the fundamental mechanism of conspiracy theory and demonization. That mechanism remained the same. Anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism converge in the assumption that Jews and Zionists are a sinister force that concentrates within itself all of the world's evil. They converge on the idea that Jews or Zionists or Israel always act out of nefarious motives. It is the demonization that unites contemporary left-wing anti-Zionism with classic right-wing anti-Semitism. In the USSR, Jews suffered the consequences of their countries adopting conspiracist anti-Zionism. I know it because I grew up there. Soviet Jews couldn't practice Judaism in part because Soviet security services concluded that Judaism was fundamentally Zionist, because Moses leads his people to the promised land, and because Jews say next year in Jerusalem. Soviet Jews saw their educational and professional opportunities diminished. They were constantly under suspicion, no matter their personal views. They experienced anti-Semitic taunting and harassment. We saw these trends in the Soviet Union. We saw the same in Poland in 1968. We see this wherever conspiracist anti-Zionism becomes prevalent in a society. And some of this is already happening here in the United States. We don't need to wonder what will happen as conspiracist anti-Zionism spreads on our campuses and in our society. We've seen it all before. It's already happened in another country. It's exceptionally well documented. All we need to do is to learn this history and to learn from it. And here is the most important lesson that this history teaches. Whenever anti-Zionism becomes widespread in a society, anti-Semitic outcomes for Jews follow. It is possible to be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. But for that, those who bill themselves as anti-Zionists need to stop relying on anti-Semitic conspiracy theory to advance their critique. They need to unlearn the habit of viewing everything related to Israel as nefarious and demonic. Most crucially, they need to understand the difference between criticism and demonization. For as long as we continue to ignore the long anti-Semitic history of the kind of anti-Zionism that dominates parts of the left-wing discourse today, we will continue to facilitate the propagation of anti-Zionist tropes that are grounded in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and therefore endanger American Jewry. So I'll stop here and I'll take questions.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question we have is from David Levine asking, could you comment on the degree to which Russian Orthodox Church's traditional theocratic anti-Semitism laid fertile ground that the Soviets capitalized on in their propaganda campaign against Israel?
Well, I think that was definitely present. It was perhaps more latent. I should say it's important to understand that the people who propagated, who created these tropes, essentially the cohort that wrote these tropes, were very right-wing in their views. Some of them were actually very far-right, and they were looking back to monarchy and to Russian Orthodox tradition, which of course was very deeply tied with the pogromist tradition, the pre-revolutionary pogromist tradition. So even though the USSR was formally atheist, right? So they couldn't really rely on the same tropes that the Orthodox Church supported or facilitated. Those ideas were definitely there as the new tropes for anti-Zionism were being written in the 60s and the 70s.
Thank you so much. Jerry Stern asked, is Putin an anti-Semite?
It's an interesting question. It's become sort of conventional wisdom to say that he isn't personally an anti-Semite, but this is the kind of thing where, you want to look at actions, right? The kind of environment. First of all, I never personally really bought into the idea that Putin isn't anti-Semitic. I think he may be philo-Semitic in that kind of way that we know is a flip side of anti-Semitism, where he needs Jews to be doing certain things or behaving in a certain way, or he needs Israel to be behaving in a certain way in order to remain friendly. And as soon as they kind of stray from what he wants, then his displeasure becomes known. But I think most importantly, the climate that we see today in Russia, this may not necessarily be intentional. I'm not saying that this is state-driven, and there are signs that it isn't. But the climate that is currently prevailing in Russia is definitely creating preconditions for anti-Semitism. We hear things from state propaganda channels that are very, very disturbing and worrying. And I think it's a very concerning time for Jews in Russia right now.
Absolutely. Thank you. Andrea asked, it seems to me, especially online, on campus, and on social media, that anti-Zionism is a popular and rising trend. Do you see any effective method for tackling this form of anti-Jewish hatred?
Well, look, as with any conspiracy theory, there isn't a simple answer because we are dealing to a considerable degree with a conspiracy theory. And, as always, I think a big part of the answer is education. And I think we really need to be clear that we are dealing with the kind of assumptions about Israel and Zionism where you can't really convince people because conspiracy theories are sort of hermetically sealed, right? The people who live inside conspiracy theories can't believe otherwise. You can't argue them out of it. So if they believe that Israel is always acting out of nefarious moments, so Zionists are evil, it's very hard to convince them. But I think that what we need to be doing is to fighting for people who are not yet so radicalized as to not be able to come back. And here, education is really, really important.
Thank you so much. And Madan Lal asks, why are American Jews divided on anti-Jewish mindset in the world?
Well, I wish we had a little bit more specificity here. I'm going to take a shot at the meaning. Why are American Jews divided on an anti-Jewish sentiment in the world? I'm going to assume that the question has to do with why do American Jews not understand, perhaps. I think that American Jews miss the idea that anti-Semitism comes from the left. I think that American Jews often push this idea away. And I think that there are a number of reasons for that. For somebody like me, who is from the USSR, it's a completely obvious notion that that there is anti-Semitism on the left. It just comes in a different form. Those of us who come from the socialist bloc, for us, it's completely obvious. American Jews, I think there are gaps in education. I think that American Jews were brought up to believe, essentially, they grew up on the stories of the Holocaust, and so they've come to believe that the only threat comes from the right. And I think it's a mistake, and I think it's something that we need to be teaching, because right now, so much of the threat comes from the left. It may not be necessarily, a lot of times people will say, well, it's the far right that murders the Jews. That is correct. But it doesn't mean that that's the only danger. What happens on the left is very insidious. We see it in the way that certain mindsets take over, and it becomes hard to fight because it's also in your own environment. And so it's much harder it's part of the cultural discourse. The far right discourse about Jews still remains outside accepted discourse. But the left-wing ideas about Jews and Zionists in Israel they're increasingly embraced. And that's what makes it so difficult. And I want to again emphasize that once it happens, Jews will suffer consequences.
Absolutely. Thank you. JL asks, we now have U.S. congressmen who are members of the Democratic Party who are openly anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic, and rampant anti-Semitism in the news media and college campuses. One, what parallels can you draw between the Soviet Union's anti-Zionism, and also, do you see another Holocaust as a possibility in the U.S. or in any other country?
Well, the parallels, once again, are very clear to me. The parallels are in the rhetoric. When I hear what these congresswomen, congressmen say, it's literally just repeating the same ideas and the same slogans. And people often ask me, how did it happen? I mentioned some of the channels, but basically, why is it that suddenly today these slogans emerge? I think that they became part of conventional thinking on the left, especially on the far left, in the 70s and the 80s. And today we see the rise of the far left. And with that, we see the return and the reemergence of these tropes. Do I see another Holocaust happening in the United States or elsewhere? I think that's, that seems not particularly realistic to me. I mean, unless there's the Iranian threat that's probably more, perhaps, God forbid, but that seems more real. I think as far as the Holocaust, in the shape in which it happened, I mean, I think that this is one danger that we guard against fairly strongly. So I can't say that I think it's realistic, but this is also what makes the current moment so precarious, is that we're looking in one direction only, right? We're used to be looking for one type of danger, and we're not looking over here. So we're looking here, we're not looking over here, and we're missing a lot of things that are coming from this direction. Because remember, we talked about how anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory which mutates and adapts to the current situation. So in the 20s, it's the Bolshevik Jew. Later on, it's the Zionist Jew who is a threat. And so we have to be much more adaptable in understanding how the anti-Semitic theory mutates and how it impacts us in the current moment, in the current environment.
Absolutely. And you spoke quite a bit about anti-Semitism versus anti-Zionism. Can you go a little further into that and explain the difference and how it can be damaging?
Well, there are many people who try to explain the difference and try to draw the line and say that it's very, very clear that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not the same. And yet we see these, I'm going to say, well-meaning left-wing people walk into anti-Semitic territory all the time, right? Just right now, as we speak, there is a scandal with a cartoonist who posted a cartoon in The Guardian, which I'm sure, based on this person's views and based on The Guardian's views, they probably thought that there's nothing anti-Semitic about it, that maybe, I don't know, I'm not sure it was about Israel necessarily, but I think a lot of times this is what you see, that people think, well, this is anti-Zionist, and then they use the same tropes that link the image or the text to the protocols of the elders of Zion. I think that the line between the two is very, very thin as to be non-existent, and this is, I mean, in the 20s, in the 30s, before the establishment of the State of Israel, even in the Soviet Union, which was always anti-Zionist, right? It was completely possible to be anti-Zionist and not be conspiracist. You could be arguing against Zionism as an ideology. You could be legitimately arguing against the establishment of the State of Israel. But in the 60s and 70s, they rewrote and redefined Zionism, and therefore they redefined anti-Zionism for it. And so it became conspiracies. I think that as long as the conspiracies sort of assumptions and tropes are there, you're going to be in the same territory. You're not going to be able to divide the two. So in theory, it is possible. It's just that in the current iteration of how it is presented, they sound exactly the same. So I think it's very hard.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the power of a picture versus words. Can you touch on that as well? That was an interesting point.
Sure, absolutely. A couple of years ago, I wrote an article for the tablet where I compared some of the cartoons that the USSR produced and claimed that they were anti-Zionist to some of the contemporary anti-Zionist cartoons. And you can see the same anti-Semitic tropes and depictions. So yeah, images are very powerful. And we need to remember that. They cross borders easily.
Absolutely. Borders, languages, all of it. So an anonymous attendee asks, what does the average Russian citizen feel about Israel and Jewish citizens in Russia? And have those feelings changed since the USSR?
This is a really good question. I don't have access to any surveys on this, and I don't even know if any have been conducted. But I can say, I mean, in terms of how the average Russian feels about Jews, certainly not since the start of the war in Ukraine. But I can tell you for sure that the anti-Zionist propaganda that exists in America today does not exist in Russia, kind of in the same way as we see it here. It probably exists, but very, very kind of far fringes. And I would say that it mostly actually exists on the far right fringes, because once the Soviet Union fell apart, a lot of this anti-Zionist propaganda, which was ostensibly left-wing, actually moved to the far right of the spectrum. So Russian neo-fascist parties adopted it. Russians understand. I would argue that those Russians who know this history, they understand that these tropes come from Soviet history, and they are very loath to use them. A lot of Russians have friends and relatives in Israel. They travel to Israel a lot. They see reality on the ground, and that's another thing that happens. I think with anti-Zionists in the United States, they, in an attempt to prevent normalization, as they put it, they don't go to Israel, or they try to prevent others from going to Israel. And so they separate more and more from reality on the ground. Russians travel to Israel a lot. Now, I'm generalizing, but I would say, the war after the Soviet Union fell apart, there were important pieces of research that came out in the same organizations that used to legitimize anti-Zionist propaganda. Their scholars wrote about how they sort of showed the anatomy of that propaganda, and they said openly that this was state-driven and it had nothing to do with reality, and that it relied on anti-Semitic ideas.
Thank you so much. Daniel Pipe says, thank you for a very clear analysis. How deeply did Soviet anti-Zionism affect Islamist thinking?
Well, I think that the connection there is very, very strong. I, by the way, think that it's a two-way street, because we see some of the people who produce Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda were actually Arabists by training, and we can trace from their biographies how they served as a link between the Soviet regime and the Arab world. And they borrowed from Arab anti-Zionist propaganda, which itself, if we think about Egypt, for example, in the 1950s, the anti-Israel propaganda there was produced by a Nazi fugitive. So you see this kind of crazy blend, right, of Nazi, Arab, Soviet anti-Zionism and anti-Israelism. I think that the opposite way is most definitely there. I mean, I wrote an article in Tablet about Mahmoud Abbas's dissertation, where if you trace the intellectual underpinnings of that work, you can see that it is all the Zionologists, the far-right Soviet writers who produced anti-Zionist propaganda. This is the source that underlies his dissertation. And of course, Mahmoud Abbas was an excellent investment for the Soviet Union, because he rose and became really influential. And so I think today, I'm pretty sure that Soviet books, Soviet anti-Zionist books, were produced in Arabic. They were produced in Persian and really spread widely through the Middle East. So I think that the influence there is very clear.
Thank you. Yehudit asks, would you consider that these tropes have come full circle from the Tsarist anti-Semitic propaganda to the Soviets and now back to the far right in Russia?
Thank you for this question. This is something that dawned on me, I don't know, maybe a year ago, as I was doing all this research. And it's a really chilling idea, but I think that this is really, this is the chain of succession that we can talk about, of sort of intellectual journey that these ideas took. It is in fact full circle. And I think that is what makes it so just so chilling to think about contemporary left, right, progressives, including young Jews, repeating tropes that were originally produced by probably their forefathers 4 generations back, who fled Russia because it was so anti-Semitic. So today, these tropes travel all the way to the United States in the Soviet kind of ostensibly left-wing form. And so the descendants of those Jews who fled Russia are using these tropes to claim that they're being progressive. I think it's a really toxic mix, and I think that we really need to put a lot of effort into untangling it. Because it's toxic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And before we go, can you please tell our viewers where we can find some more of your work in this upcoming book of yours?
Sure. So yes, I'm under contract with Routledge to write a book about kind of analyzing Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda. I'm hoping to write it in an accessible language because I really want for it to reach wider audiences. A lot of my articles on this subject are on Tablet. If you find me on Tablet magazine, you'll find some articles there. One of my articles was published on Fathom. If you just Google my name and Fathom, it will come up. It was the first article that's very often quoted. So these are the main places.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we've come to the close of our webinar. Thank you again, Ms. Tabarovsky, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. For our viewers, please join us Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern for an update with Ashley Perry. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Bye-bye.